You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
A lot of work after the revolution went into sanitizing the revolution and mythologizing it as, unlike other revolutions that descended into violence and chaos and bloodshed, the American Revolution was different and special because it was lawful, respectable, relatively bloodless. But we know that that notion of the bloodless revolution is in many ways incorrect. The revolution was quite violent, both before and after independence was declared.
Hello, and welcome to episode 393 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The United States Constitution is a framework or plan for the government of the United States. The Constitution establishes the primacy of the national law and government over state governments. Its 27 amendments establish protections for the individual rights of its citizens. In essence, the Constitution serves as the foundation of the United States government. Now, the Constitution is also a document of we the people. And the ways Americans have supported, debated, and interpreted the Constitution in 1787 and beyond have played a role in the rise of politics and political parties within the United States. So what kind of political culture did the United States Constitution and its interpretations help establish? What were the expectations, practices, and cultural norms that early Americans had to follow when debating the Constitution or its interpretations in the early American Republic? In honor of Constitution Day on September 17, the day the United States commemorates the signing of the United States Constitution, we're going to speak with two historians, Jonathan Gnapp, an associate professor of history and associate professor of law at Stanford University, and Rachel Sheldon, director of the Richard Civil War Era Center and an associate professor of history at Penn State University. We'll speak with these historians about early American political culture and political civility in the early American Republic. Now, during our exploration, Jonathan and Rachel reveal how historians define political culture and how early Americans understood their political culture. Information about codes of conduct, how they defined political civility, and why these codes were both written and unwritten. And details about how early Americans acted politically and civically in the early American Republic, and how their participation might inform ways to reignite political participation within the United States today. But first, the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios team and I are working on some really exciting episodes. Episodes that explore Carpenter's Hall and the 250th anniversary of the First Continental Congress, Native American history, and our 10-year anniversary episode in early October. Now, to ensure that you catch all of our episodes, follow Ben Franklin's World in your favorite podcast app. To follow Ben Franklin's World, open up your favorite app, search for Ben Franklin's World, and then hit the follow or subscribe button. Okay. Are you ready to explore how early Americans behaved and acted politically in the early American Republic? Let's go meet our guest historians. Today we have two guests. Jonathan Gnapp is an associate professor of history and associate professor of law at Stanford University. His research focuses on the constitutional, political, legal, and intellectual history of the United States, especially early American debates about constitutionalism, which is the topic of his book, The Second Creation: Fixing the American Constitution in the Founding Era. He is also hard at work writing a new book about the history of the Constitution's preamble, tentatively titled, We the People of the United States: The Struggle Over Popular Sovereignty and Nationhood. Our second guest is Rachel Sheldon, an associate professor of history and the director of the Richard Civil War Era Center at Penn State University. She's a scholar of political, constitutional, and legal history, with a particular focus on the 19th century. You may remember Rachel from episode 78, where we spoke with her about her first book, Washington Brotherhood: Politics, Social Life, and the Coming of the Civil War, which explores the social and political lives of congressmen in Washington, D.C. during the 1840s and 1850s. Presently, Rachel is working on a new book called The Political Supreme Court, which examines the political world of the United States Supreme Court justices during the 19th century. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jonathan Gnapp and Rachel Sheldon.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for having us, Liz.
So I think we should start our conversation by talking about what we mean by political culture and civility in the early American Republic. So Jonathan, you study the early American Republic. Rachel, you study the later early American Republic. Would you tell us how you define these terms and about the different ways that you study political culture and political civility in early America?
Sure. Political culture, as I see it, is the way that politics is practiced in a given time and place. So there are formal political institutions and procedures that structure political life. How many houses of the legislature are there? Who votes? How do people get into office? But there's also sort of set of unwritten, habituated norms or attitudes that animate the way politics is actually practiced within that general structure. Think sort of the sets of values, assumptions, customs that compel people to behave a certain way because they're trying to conform to certain expectations, but also allow others to police their behavior, to kind of note ways in which they've breached protocol. But in addition to this, I think it's not just codes or norms of conduct or particular kinds of practices. It's also a description of what really animates a political system. It describes the sort of field of meaning against which political actors behave. So human beings are symbolic creatures. We invest our surrounding in meaning and react to that. So at any given time and place, certain sets of things are politically potent and meaningful, out of which politicians tell stories, as they always do, about who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, why you ought to be loyal to them. And political culture is, in my mind, among other things, a study of that field of symbolic meaning. It's kind of reservoir, the web of connected symbols out of which people put together potent political statements, platforms from which ideologies draw.
I would say something very similar, that it's sort of the unspoken norms or practices or ideas that animate people in the past. I think it's sort of the general language in which people operate that is very hard to identify because nobody is going to tell you what it is. It's so obvious to everyone who's operating in it that it would not be worth writing down. Because why would you write down something that is so obvious to everybody who is operating in it? Which makes it very hard to study, because you're not going to get someone writing it down and telling you what it is. As a result, you sort of have to immerse yourself in the language of it. You have to try to figure out what it is that they're up to. So it can look very similar to things that we do today, but actually mean something very different to people in the past. I think about this from the perspective of, say, what it was like to vote in the 19th century, what it was like to go to the polls to vote. And so today we have certain kinds of voting practices that you go and it's a very formal process and it feels very formal if you go to the voting booth. But it wasn't like that in the 19th century. And there were a series of parties and galas that are part of the voting process in the 19th century that look totally weird to us today, but were part of sort of the experience of voting. And that was just the norm. And people had opinions about that, but they don't sort of write about them in the same way that we might imagine today. So there are sort of standardized laws that tell you how things work, but then there are practices that you have to interrogate in different ways because they are not written down as like, this is how people celebrated going to the polls. You have to learn about them in sort of orthogonal ways.
You mentioned symbolic rituals, informal and formal practices when it came to voting, civility, and political culture, and how it worked in the early American Republic, and how we have to really immerse ourselves in early American political culture to really understand it. Because the political culture, those sets of practices and norms about how people behave politically, was so common to people that they didn't write it down. So they don't say, this is our political culture, and we're writing it down for you people in the future. So what we historians really have to do is work with historical sources that early Americans did leave behind, the words and the objects they left behind, so that we can try and experience this aspect of early American culture to better understand it. So Jonathan and Rachel, how did early Americans establish these unwritten rules and symbols that came to define their political culture? And how did these unwritten rules and symbols inform how early Americans should act and behave in appropriate political ways?
It's a complex question because different people were trying to accomplish different things. Just as you said, it's sort of an unwritten rule book that keeps things organized. And broadly speaking, in the 18th century, people were interested in that. You mentioned civility at the top, in certain codes of conduct that would keep society contained. Everybody had baser instincts that were part of their humanity, but needed to be suppressed. That was part of what it meant to be civil or civilized. Code of conduct books were all the rage in the 18th century Atlantic world. And Americans were especially drawn to them because they had this inferiority complex. We are provincial outsiders on the margins of the polite, civilized world. We simply can't compare to European society, manners, learning. So one of the ways in which we can strive for that is to take these code of conduct books, these civility manuals, 110 rules of how you behave in polite society, and perform that kind of civility. For instance, we know a young George Washington, who becomes obviously a very important political figure in the early republic, was known to have copied the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation when he was young, and he drew on them throughout his life. There were a lot of books like this. Joseph Addison and Richard Steele's daily The Spectator was read by James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and others. People were very interested in what differentiated civil behavior from uncivil behavior. And this translated directly into how people were trying to build the political system. There was an understanding that just as civil conduct in polite society would mark that you were of a better class, more worthy as an individual, that also could signal and indicate that you were worthy of having political power, of ruling. People tried to translate some of those same basic rules from society generally into politics, that you will not do certain things that are uncivil, or if you do, there are certain ways in which people not only should respond, but must respond. But at the same time, these things are open for debate and contested. The American Revolution unleashes this sort of democratic language of equality. And there are a whole bunch of people who say the purpose of the revolution is to empower ordinary people like me. And I'm not going to play by those rules. The political field is not going to be organized in those ways. I'm going to express myself. I'm going to vote for people who go to office who don't just represent my interests, but represent a different style. They're going to sort of flout those rules of civility. So it creates a kind of combustible political culture because you've got different people trying to establish different unwritten rules and having debates about both policy and the way you debate at the same time that leads to some explosive conflicts.
Rachel, did early Americans take these sometimes combustible 18th century rules of political civility, these informal customs that they were trying to mimic from Great Britain, and codify them in the 19th century? Did they try to put these societal norms on paper in a way similar to the way they decided to put the rules of government down on paper in a written constitution?
Well, in Washington, there were a lot of sort of etiquette books that mimic this. They're mostly aimed at women who are meant to go around and visit each other in a very particular order. So there was a status order for women in Washington with wives of members of the House at the very bottom who had to go and visit wives of senators and wives of cabinet members and wives of the justices and wives of other kinds of very important Washington society members like Dolly Madison. And so they had to go and do this before they could be visited, and then they had to return those calls. And so these kinds of things were written down of what women were supposed to do, but they didn't always follow them. And it's not exactly clear what the consequences were for not actually following them. You could be shunned in Washington society, but what was the real consequence of being shunned in Washington society? Was your husband going to get into any kind of trouble? Maybe, maybe not. There's a woman named Peggy Eaton in the 1830s who is a shady character who's had sort of an affair maybe while she's married and gets married to a member of Jackson's cabinet and then is shunned by many of the other wives in Jackson's cabinet, and much to Jackson's dismay. And after that, there's sort of a lot of, well, if she could do it, well, I could do it. So as a result, I think they're not necessarily big consequences to not following them, although many women try to follow them. It sort of depends on who is in charge and when. And as a result, it's hard to measure how important those kinds of etiquette books are. That's why it's hard to rely on those kinds of texts, right? We have to be careful in determining whether they actually tell you that much about the culture in which things are happening.
As scholars who study politics and culture in early America, Jonathan mostly in the 18th century, Rachel mostly in the 19th century, would you be able to tell us how early Americans defined civility or political civility? Stessa is curious to know how early Americans defined civility at a time when the nation was still finding itself, and as she admits, politics could be quite fractious. So what were the rules in those etiquette books for behaving in politics and political society?
Some of it is just basic decorum, politeness, respectability, things that I think make sense to us today when we complain that our politics has turned uncivil. The idea that you disagree without being disagreeable, that you show people personal respect, dignity, worthiness. But in addition to that, it was part of this broader project that you were demonstrating that you were in control of your passions, that you were not succumbing to baser instincts. So you would conduct yourself politically in such a way that demonstrated that you were a rational being who was in control. You were in control of body and mind at all times. But within that, it was also considered not just acceptable, but a marker of being in control that you knew how to insult in the right way, or to just walk a fine enough line where you were almost impugning someone's character, but without doing so, that there was a real art to it. So we would see some of these things in the early republic and think, oh, well, this isn't particularly civil at all. This is a kind of civil form of incivility. But that was essential to the codes of practice as well. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, you have a lot of new people who are joining politics. The American Revolution has created new opportunities. So these codes of civility, I mean, if you just read through the manners of that civility book that I mentioned George Washington copied out of, this was showing respect to superiors, civility to inferiors, things like that. But it's very much an open question who's a superior and who's an inferior. You have a political class who thinks they're superior, thinks that because of their codes of conduct, their learning, their commitment to a broader vision of the public good, that they are fit to rule. We have a whole set of other people who don't buy that premise and say, this is a democratic society. You are not an aristocracy. You don't have formal titles before the law. You have no de facto birthright to rule. And we're going to overtly challenge that. You have this delicate situation where people are trying to construct this world that is elite controlled, but out of democratic materials that at every turn is undermining it. And all of this is being channeled through these sort of unwritten codes of conduct that are both sort of ratcheting up the intensity, the sort of need to turn to them, but also showing in lots of ways their complete ineffectiveness. How far are you going to get with these basic rules that can be very general in character?
I think one of the things that's hard to measure in relationship to our current thoughts about civility is that we have to remember that there's a baseline in the late 18th and 19th century of violence that exists. When we talk about civil society, we're talking about any form of violence being totally outside the norm. But people are engaging in violence all the time in the 19th century. And when they're arguing with each other, even the people who we expect to be the most civil, they are constantly engaging in violent behavior. I mean, they're throwing bricks at each other. They're slapping each other. They're doing this all the time. And these are the politicians. These are people on the street. These are people everywhere in America. So we're not dealing with a baseline of nonviolent behavior. And as a result of that, when we're talking about civility, we're talking about that at a level that is above just sort of a baseline of nonviolent behavior. Everyone is violent in the 19th century. Everyone is engaging in violent behavior. All congressmen are engaging in violent behavior. This is like just part of their experience. If you read the records of Congress in the early 19th century all the way up through the Civil War, people are hitting each other all the time, throwing things at each other all the time. And this is well expected. It's not just sort of horrifying to people. It's just part of the experience. When you're thinking about civility, you have to think about it as separate from sort of our modern understanding of what is civil behavior.
I'm curious about this idea that you've both talked about, which is the etiquette of uncivil behavior, or the ways that one could essentially be civilly uncivil towards each other in a political realm. Now, there does seem to have been an appropriate way to disagree with someone or to offer a political dig in the late 18th and 19th centuries and still seem to have been a civil person rather than an argumentative person. And if we think about Joanne Freeman's work, right, her books Affairs of Honor and Field of Blood, where she specifically explores the violence of early American political actors and specifically congressmen towards one another, then we come up with these well-known examples of the political violence, that baseline violence that you were talking about, Rachel, like the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr in 1804, and quite famously, Congressman Preston Brooks's beating of Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor in 1856. So I wonder if you would both expand on the appropriate ways that early American political actors were able to act and disagree uncivilly in such a way that their fellow early Americans still perceived them as being civil political actors in these early periods.
So one of the things that happens in Congress, for example, is that people get into fights all the time. And part of the reason for this is that it is well accepted and desired by constituents. It's a performative process. The Congressional Globe, which is the main record of Congress in the antebellum period, the period before the Civil War, records these things that people read about these fights in Congress and these debates in Congress. And they expect to see their congressmen sticking up for them, sticking up for their ideas. And so they want to see their congressmen being a little violent, being a little pushy about their opinions. And it could be a really useful thing to do, to start a fight with somebody if you wanted to keep your seat in Congress. This happens a lot. And it also happens that people will get into arguments and then they will decide, well, maybe I shouldn't have gotten into this argument. And I'm going to correct the record so that people don't know that I got into this argument. So there are ways in which people engage in deciding what kind of civil behavior should exist in the record based on their conversations, both with their constituents and also with each other. Even the caning of Charles Sumner, that's an extreme example, but it's also an example in which there are lots of congressmen who expect this kind of behavior. They expect that there is going to be this kind of violence on the floor of the House and Senate. And several of them sort of think, well, okay, moving on to the next one after it's over. Certainly Charles Sumner doesn't feel that way. After several of the congressmen who are Republicans and senators who are Republicans are like, okay, we're moving on from this. We're still going to engage with our fellow Southerners. We're going to engage in some of the same kind of serious rhetoric. Of course, Preston Brooks, after the caning of Charles Sumner, is loved by his constituents. So this is one way that you could get support from back home. This is not considered uncivil among your constituents. This is considered part of your job to engage in this kind of behavior.
In the early republic, when the so-called founding generation is building the United States and its political institutions, many of them would be shocked and appalled by some of the things Rachel just described so well, that the political world had turned into that. But that doesn't mean, as she said correctly, that they were trying to keep violence out of politics. Politics often turned violent. As you mentioned, there were a lot of duels, such as the one between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. What codes of conduct and civility was supposed to do was separate honorable, civil, gentlemanly way of engaging in violence and ungentlemanly, uncivil ways of engaging in violence that was not like a formal duel that followed a set of rituals, but was brawling in public. But again, the political culture was a competition over what kind of political culture it would be. So we see this clearly, I think, in a wonderful episode that's always fun to teach in 1798, when the competing kinds of politics and political personalities clash in a very direct way in the House of Representatives, when Matthew Lyon and Roger Griswold of Vermont and Connecticut, respectively, end up brawling on the floor of Congress. So Matthew Lyon is right out of central casting, one of these new men. He's Irish-born, he's rough-hewn, and he wears this as a badge of honor. He thinks the American Revolution, its essential aim was to create a kind of egalitarian politics that gave people like him, the common man, as he himself put it, a voice in politics and a chance to express that stylistically. And people like Roger Griswold, a Federalist from Connecticut, represented this sort of stodgier, wannabe, gentlemanly way that was so offensive because it stood in opposition to the egalitarianism that the revolution was supposed to embody. During a debate in early 1798, Griswold is trying to get Matthew Lyon's attention because they're on opposite partisan sides. They disagree about the issue. Lyon is ignoring Griswold, which really upsets him. So he finally loses temper and calls Lyon a scoundrel, which is fighting words back in the 18th century. That's a pretty aggressive insult. At this point, Lyon says, "I'd be happy to fight you. I'm here to fight for the interests of the common man," suggesting that Griswold is on the opposite side of that. At this point, Griswold calls back to Lyon's time in the Continental Army, when, depending upon who you asked, he may have been guilty of cowardice and forced to wear a wooden sword, which was a marker of that. He says, "Are you going to fight me with your wooden sword?" So he's called him a scoundrel. Now he's accused him of being a coward. So at this point, Matthew Lyon, not thinking that he shouldn't cross certain lines, spits in Roger Griswold's face. So things have escalated to this point pretty dramatically. Lyon is later willing to apologize, but not in a fashion that is considered acceptable to Griswold. So Griswold ends up attacking him with a wooden cane, knocking him down into the fireplace on the house floor. Matthew Lyon grabs nearby fire tongs and the two begin brawling, and only because others break it up does the fight stop. We see here very much what happens when you have different people who think different styles of politics are acceptable. The politics is being played out in real time, not just over substance and policy, but also style itself. And that's not particularly veiled. In some ways, Roger Griswold is able to be pulled down into Matthew Lyon's world, the world that Rachel describes that becomes normal, which is a much more brawling, freestyling politics that doesn't pretend, if you will, to be organized by these elevated forms of civility. Oh, it's fine if we kill each other, just as long as we do so in a rule-bound, gentlemanly way, that somehow is acceptable.
Now, Warren and Melissa are curious about issues of class when it came to civility in early American political culture. We've just talked about how early American congressmen and other political officers of the nation had these unwritten rules of civility. But what did political civility look like on the ground with seemingly ordinary people, those common men, as you just talked about, Jonathan? So, for example, when we talk about the Revolutionary era, before the outbreak of the War for Independence, we know that there are a lot of protests. We can see these in the historical record. But when we look at those records, we'll see at the time in the 18th century, these protests weren't referred to as protests. They were referred to as riots. So can you tell us what it was like on the ground for everyday early Americans to exercise political civility, or perhaps maybe this was their appropriate political incivility during what might be called riots or protests?
Great question, because I think it gets right at the double-edged sword I've been alluding to. So riots and protests were an essential feature of the revolutionary struggle. Without people in the streets protesting in quite aggressive ways, there is no American Revolution. So that kind of street activity that could verge on destruction and violence is essential to winning independence. And I think there are two different ways to interpret what's going on that get to the heart of the issues we're thinking about here. So one is just simply to highlight how uncivil revolutions by their nature are. A lot of work after the revolution went into sanitizing the revolution and mythologizing it as, unlike other revolutions that descended into violence and chaos and bloodshed, the American Revolution was different and special because it was lawful, respectable, relatively bloodless. But we know that that notion of the bloodless revolution is in many ways incorrect. The revolution was quite violent, both before and after independence was declared, not just protesting British policy, but once the Patriot movement takes shape, an effort to discipline and defend conformity from one's neighbors who might have remained loyal to the British crown, knocking on their door and saying, you're going to sign a loyalty oath, or something might happen, and particularly violent things did happen. So the revolution's won by force. The riots that break out in the streets, such as the riots that initially protest the Stamp Act in the mid-1760s, they were crowds that intimidated and threatened colonial officials, made it very clear in a way that went far beyond the formal protests found in resolves or petitions or things that emanated from the quasi-legislative chambers that American colonists were gathering in. These things were going to be backed by force, that there was going to be potentially blood if the British went forward with these policies. So it very much shows how the kinds of civil codes that were being followed in how American leaders were petitioning the British government were necessarily being supported by something that would be deemed less civil and less acceptable. But at the same time, the second way we can think about it is there was a concerted effort to differentiate, just as you said, Liz, a protest from a mob or a crowd from a mob. That there were, as there were with politics generally, certain rituals or scripts that if you followed, your crowd activity could be legitimate and in fact legal. And this was a long-standing practice in the English-speaking world of the people themselves engaging in crowd activity and expressing themselves politically. As long as they hewed to certain lines, it was considered acceptable. So some people said, look at the American mobs. They said this in the 1760s, 70s, and onward. How well-behaved they are, how moderate they are, how conservative they are, how rational they are. This isn't just spontaneous violence. They're not just targeting people willy-nilly. It's organized activity. When they destroy property, it's very specific and circumscribed. Certain targets are off limits. This is a very rational form of mob behavior. Now, to other people looking at it from afar, especially the British perspective, they had the exact opposite interpretation. It was usually not to say that these kinds of crowd activities were bad. What made the American example so bad is that it was out of control. Examples like the Boston Tea Party showed there's no limits to this. They're willing to destroy property to an extraordinary degree. And worse, the leaders who claim they have control of them don't have control of them at all. They've sort of lit a fuse, and this is running wild. But what's interesting is once independence is secured, this kind of crowd activity doesn't go away. It's a basic way that ordinary people express themselves politically. But you see an about face of the revolutionary leadership class, where they needed that exact kind of crowd activity prior to 1776 to win independence. Now, rather than celebrate it or apologize for it or interpret it in ways that sanitize it, they instead say, this is so vile and terrible. Shays' Rebellion, these indebted farmers in Western Massachusetts would deign to rise up against the Massachusetts government. Later in the 1790s, the Whiskey Rebels of Western Pennsylvania. Now that they are challenging not British rule, but American rule, there is a concerted effort to explain why this kind of crowd activity is bad, but again, using the same script the British did. What's so bad about the Shays'ites, what's so bad about the Whiskey Rebels is they're not behaving like the good Stamp Act rioters. I think we see that a bit today, right? Whatever protest happens to break out in the United States, people always like to call back to some prior moment when the protests were handled differently and better, in a more respectful way, in a more orderly way, in a more organized way, in a more civil way. If only today's protesters could learn from that example. But that very kind of scolding is something we see from the very beginning. Each new protest is distinguished from the one that came before.
And what about in the 19th century, Rachel? What did political civility look like among ordinary people who were not in governmental office in the 19th century?
Just to connect this a little bit to something that Jonathan was saying earlier, I think there's a degree to which political elites blame large groups of people protesting on them being beholden to some other power. Like in the 1850s, when you have a large group of Catholics who are unhappy with, for example, laws that are preventing them from teaching in public schools, anything that is going to smell of Catholic teachings, they say that they're beholden to the Pope power and that the Pope is controlling them. So this becomes sort of a rhetoric of they are not independent thinkers. They don't have control over their own minds. And as a result, they can't even have civility because they don't really count in terms of civil protest because they don't have independence as people. There's not real interest in thinking about them as actual players or people that have citizenship in the United States or a legitimacy to any kind of protest. And that's the kind of rhetoric that a lot of political elites use with almost anyone they think is behaving inappropriately. You know, abolitionists, they treat that way. And then Northerners use the same kinds of accusations against slaveholders when they refer to slaveholders and their activities as the slave power. So the idea of being an independent person is really central to having the ability to have civility in politics. And that's the way that it's weaponized against large groups of people.
Now, Rachel, when we first spoke in episode 78 about your book, Washington's Brotherhood, you told us a lot about boarding houses and the impact that living arrangements had on the ability of congressmen to get along. So would you help us remember how the fact that congressmen lived side by side together in boarding houses during the 19th century impacted early American ideas of civility? Did political life become more civil, do you think, even as the canings and fisticuffs took place on the floors of Congress, because the congressmen were living side by side together?
Yeah, I think living together was really important for civility in terms of at least people getting along. You could have people who were from different sections living together who seem on their face like they wouldn't get along and got along just fine in their boarding houses and their hotels. Slaveholders and non-slaveholders. You would have folks who were invested in certain kinds of abolitionist ideas versus people who were interested in perpetuating slavery in the West who could live together just fine. And that kind of civility in our sort of modern terms could work. It often didn't translate into how they behaved on the floor of Congress. They would not want that to show in their congressional speeches, but in terms of how they work together in the boarding houses and hotels, it seemed to go just fine. What's happening behind the scenes and what's happening publicly was very different. And you might say that's similar to today or recently. I don't know if it's still happening today, where people could get along quite well and then be kind of nasty to one another in public just to perform for their constituents. and that there are real consequences to that. Because if you really rile up your constituents, but you actually get along just fine, what are your constituents going to think is actually going on? Certainly, it creates a lot of anger among people not in Washington that might help perpetuate problems that might lead to civil war. I don't know. We may be in those kinds of circumstances now. I don't mean to suggest that we're about to end up in a civil war, but this is the kind of thing that it does. It creates a misconception of how well congressmen are getting along.
I'm really glad you brought up consequences because I was hoping we could discuss what the consequences were for behaving badly in political situations in the early American Republic. So, Jonathan, let's start with the early Republic right after we take a moment to thank our episode sponsor. On September 17, the United States celebrates Constitution Day. Constitution Day commemorates the signing of the United States Constitution on September 17, 1787, which is why on this day, the United States celebrates citizenship and what it means to be an American citizen. Here at the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, we're meeting with our colleagues from across the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation to prepare some great resources that'll help you celebrate and explore American citizenship. For example, our video team is preparing a short series of fun videos that explore the origin and evolution of American government and voting rights in the United States. The Bob and Marion Wilson Teacher Institute is going to host a teacher training about media literacy, as democracy in the United States has always relied on an informed citizenry. And here in Williamsburg, Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg is working on plans to host a naturalization ceremony so that we can welcome new American citizens to the United States. To learn more about the exciting resources we're preparing for Constitution Day, visit benfranklinsworld.com/civics. That's benfranklinsworld.com/civics. Jonathan, what were the consequences of behaving badly in political situations during the early Republic, during the late 18th century?
Certainly, a lot of people who were in politics wished there were. So people who were clinging to an elite style of politics that will somehow fit seamlessly into this emerging democratic world in which people have more of a voice and more of a power base than they have before is creating problems, because if you point to an unwritten code of conduct and say, you can't do that, that violates some protocol, what do you do when other people shrug their shoulders and say they don't care? Or what if you assume that everything's going to be held together by one sense of their own honor? So at minimum, people aren't going to accept being viewed as dishonorable by their colleagues. So that's going to sort of shame them into line. That is a consequence that works for many. I mean, that's precisely why you get the Hamilton-Burr duel, and you get so many episodes in the 1790s, because people would rather play out the codes of conduct that require potentially engaging in deadly activity than be branded dishonorable. But there are lots of people who are willing to make it clear that they're going to play by a different set of rules. And the whole reason that they're in the political system is to do that. The Sedition Act that was passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress in the late 1790s was an effort to try to clamp down on this exploding world of partisan print that was not only giving so many political outsiders a voice. So we can think of this as early versions of social media, right? What happens when suddenly more people can join the conversation than ever before? And the common complaint is it's so completely uncivil. These printers, who are really the kind of foot soldiers of the emerging Democratic Republican Party, are the most uncivil, unwashed, disgraceful people you can find. They're not even Americans often. I mean, xenophobic language about how they're foreigners, many of them like Matthew Lyon, he's from Ireland. So the Sedition Act basically makes it a crime to engage in false or malicious commentary on the government, particularly the president. And Matthew Lyon himself, who is a printer, ends up in jail, prosecuted under the Sedition Act. He's the only person in American history who successfully is elected to Congress from jail. So we're seeing here their consequences. There's a real effort to enforce certain codes of civility and send Matthew Lyon to jail. But he's not backing down. He's not changing course. He doesn't care about some of these codes, and he's able to win re-election. So there are ways in which there are no consequences. So you can see it both ways. There's a desperate attempt to police these things, but the fragility of it all, which is itself mirrors the fragility of this elite-controlled political system itself, points in some ways to what Rachel underscored earlier, that one way to look at it is there are no consequences. This is people just desperately grasping at whatever they can, based on a recognition that they can't actually make anybody do anything.
Norms are norms until they're broken. We've seen a lot of that in the 21st century, and this was true in the 19th century too. Until we decide that we don't want to follow them anymore, we can have these norms. But as soon as we stop abiding by them, they're no longer norms. And that's sort of at the heart of what political culture is. I've been spending a lot of time researching the norms around Supreme Court justices and their engagement with politics and their expectations about what they could do politically. And there were a lot of norms about that in the 19th century that are no longer true. And those norms were norms until they were no longer true. And people changed their expectations. They were running for president until they were no longer allowed to run for president. This is just the way things were. So we'd have to imagine them as different because people expected them to be different until they didn't. And we can't expect norms to just exist because we want them to. They aren't written down and they're not enforceable. That's what makes it hard to study them. But it also is important because it means that people abided by different kinds of ideas about civility, but also how to engage in politics and participate in them. And we can't assume that they've always been the same way. We can't assume that it's the right way either today or that it was back then.
One way to think about political culture in the United States is it carries with it the seeds of its own destruction. So the American Revolution has unleashed this language of universal equality and empowerment for ordinary people. So there are many attempts made to control the political process to prevent it from getting out of hand. One of the most important justifications given for why the U.S. Constitution is a good reform that will remake the political system of the United States is the one that James Madison offers in a lot of his writings, but including Federalist 10, which is, we have all these state legislatures, these local legislative chambers that are very responsive to constituent interests. And what that tends to promote is a narrow-minded, self-interested, empty form of politics in which nobody is being a statesman. Nobody is looking at the bigger picture and saying, not just what is good today for my narrow slice of the constituency, but what's good for everybody. What is necessary to ensure that the United States will be healthy 20 years from now? So the hope was that the Constitution, by creating a more powerful centralized government that was less representative in character in certain respects, would in turn be representative of the better kinds of things in people. So by having larger electoral districts, for somebody to win a seat in Congress, they would have to be more like James Madison. They would have to be a respectable statesman who lived up to a certain standard. But what's interesting is when James Madison shows up in the first Congress, which is gavelled into session in April of 1789, he's not terribly impressed by the people he finds there. He maybe thinks they're a step up from the cesspool that was the Virginia House of Delegates that so infuriated him. But he's struck by the limited caliber of the people, and he's uncertain if this elaborate political system, which is supposed to be filtering the talented statesmen upward, is actually going to do that. And really the story from 1789 on is, from a certain perspective, of tragic irony. People keep hoping that it will be a certain way, but precisely because baked into the very politics that they're trying to control are the seeds that unravel that, their expectations are always subverted, and they have to live in a different world, a more fallen world from a certain perspective than the one they would like. So the effort to entrench norms that at any given point can be blown up, and it takes much longer to entrench them than it does to destroy them. We see that today. It can take decades to make a norm real. It can take 2 weeks to destroy it forever. That's the constant story of early Republican politics. So you can't do things that way. Why not? The way I'm behaving is consistent with the American Revolution and the ideals of this country. Who are you to tell me otherwise? You can't lecture me. You're no better than me. That's a vicious cycle that will constantly lead to a place that a lot of leaders don't want it to.
Rachel, you mentioned the Supreme Court and how you're working on a new book called The Political Supreme Court. And thanks to John Marshall, we know that if any branch of the early American government had a reputation for being civil, that branch was the Supreme Court. So Rachel, just how civil was the early Supreme Court in the 19th century?
Certainly it attracted people who were elite in the way that we've been talking about, but they were just as engaged in politics as anyone else. Almost all of them came from former political positions that we would think about as political positions, but also from other kinds of positions that were deeply political at the time. Many of them had been newspaper editors, which we don't imagine as political positions today, but were deeply political in the 19th century. Newspapers were run by partisans from the very earliest years of the nation, but especially in the 19th century. And so they had been involved in all kinds of newspaper activities, and some of them stayed involved in newspaper activities once they got on the bench. They ran for office. They worked on political campaigns. They wrote legislation. One of them was actually elected to local office while he was a member of the Supreme Court and stayed on the Supreme Court while he was in local office. So there were lots of examples of this. And their participation in politics was mostly well accepted in the 19th century, which tells you a little bit about how engaged people were in politics in this period, which is something that I think is really important to understanding the political culture. We haven't talked much about the average American, not just a working class person, but African Americans, women. This was a period in which everybody cared about politics and was engaged in very serious ways, petitioning in formal ways like petitioning, in writing for newspapers, but in all kinds of other ways, having conversations about politics at their kitchen table, constant engagement with the future of the nation. So it was not unusual for a Supreme Court justice to be so engaged in concerns about the future that were political. So their political culture was much more about the future as a political problem, not just a legal problem, the way we would imagine it today.
So what kinds of lessons do you think we can draw for our own present age from these earlier periods, their political cultures, and ideas about political civility? Rachel, you just mentioned that everybody in the 19th century was really interested in politics. And while I'm sure there were a few exceptions in that generalization, there really was a great quantifiable interest in politics, with voter participation peaking at over 80% of eligible voters in some presidential elections between the 1840s and 1880s. But if you look at voter participation in presidential elections today, since the 1970s, you'll find that participation hovers between 50 and a bit over 60%. So do either of you see any through lines in our discussion today that can help us make better sense of our own modern political culture?
Building off of what Rachel just talked about and what your question's alluding to, Liz, politics was understood much more capaciously in the early United States. So Rachel mentioned petitioning, which is not something that makes much sense to us. We know what a petition is, but we don't spend a lot of our time petitioning state legislatures and Congress. But this was the paradigmatic activity, especially among those less elite white men, free African Americans, women, Native Americans who were shut out from formal political power. This was a way in which they constantly engaged. The number of petitions sent to Congress beginning in 1789 was remarkable. People organized and they inundated legislatures with petitions, made themselves be heard. And while by a certain metric, they weren't terribly successful, by other metrics, they were quite successful at compelling people to acknowledge and respond to them. But that points to a broader lesson in general, that we take for granted what it means to be part of a democracy. We often fetishize a single activity within that democracy, which is very important, and people have died to earn that right, which is the right to vote. But people in the early United States would find it very strange to think that you were a democratic citizen once every 2 or 4 years when you engage in that kind of activity. Everything that happens around Election Day was a central feature of political culture. So part of what makes political culture challenging but exciting to study in the early United States is all of these things that don't seem political, not only were political, but were the essence, the marrow of politics. So there's the famous episode of the people of Cheshire, Massachusetts, making this giant mammoth cheese for Thomas Jefferson. And from our eyes, this can just seem quaint, silly, funny, but we need to take it very seriously as garden variety political activism and expression, because that's exactly what it was. It was part of this wider festive world of politics out of doors that was much more participatory in nature. A lot of people who lacked the right to vote participated in these forms of political expression, parades, festivals, toasts, and thought that the content of those activities, again, what we might think of now as something different from politics, leisure time, features of civil society. No, they were overtly political and considered importantly political. When people were coming to the realization there were going to be political parties in the United States and they needed to figure out how to mobilize the public, it was these sorts of scripts they turned to, these sorts of activities that they tapped into. It was a way to activate the electorate to ensure that Election Day would go a certain way precisely because that was the end of the process. So today, I think we can indict our political culture generally by highlighting the ways in which people have circumscribed and limited political behavior and as a result, taken a pass on politics and checked out from it. Rather than seeing, if you want the nation to go in a different direction, that doesn't just mean that you vote a particular way. That means engaging in politics in a broader sense and perhaps thinking of democracy not as a set of institutions or a particular set of defined circumscribed practices, but what Alexis de Tocqueville alluded to, that is sort of a habit of the heart. To be a democratic citizen is to conduct yourself on a daily basis in a particular way. And that saturates a lot of your activity. So I think there's a lot to be learned from not taking politics for granted at minimum and asking ourselves, did those people back then who practice a much broader form of politics have it right? Do they have something to teach us? Is part of the reason people are so turned off by politics now that we have an unhealthy form of politics because nobody practices it anymore?
I think that's such a good answer, and I'd just add two pieces to it. One is I think that a lot of us have given up our interest in politics because we don't think that we have the expertise. Particularly, I think people don't believe they have the expertise over the Constitution. And people in the 19th century and late 18th century believed that they could engage in questions of constitutionalism in ways that we no longer talk about. We don't talk about the Constitution anymore. That's the purview of the Supreme Court. We don't get to engage in that. And people in the 19th century would have thought that was crazy. Politics were about the future of the Constitution. So if we could actually start to talk about that again, maybe we would engage more in politics. And the other thing I would say that 19th century, at least before the Civil War, but really at least 25 years after the Civil War, people in the 19th century understood is the fragility of democracy. And they were worried all the time about what would happen if the democratic experiment failed. And so it felt like life or death to participate in politics. It felt like the world would collapse, truly the world, not just the United States. And so it felt so important to be engaged in politics. And it can feel easy, like nothing will happen if I don't vote, if I don't pay attention to what's going on, if I don't turn out for a board meeting or a local conversation about something involved in my community. But at that time, it did feel like life or death. So I think that can be one way to think about it, is that democracy is fragile and people in the 19th century understood that. So that's the main concern that they had that I think we've lost in the 21st century.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Now, I think you'd both agree that we have really been talking about, at least for most of our conversation, about elite white men and office holders. So what do you think would have happened to the early American political cultures if the United States Constitution had expressed a more inclusive idea of citizenship and who could participate in politics? So what I'm asking is, what do you think early American political cultures would have looked like if the Constitution had allowed women and people of color to participate more broadly in acts like voting?
I hesitate to offer this answer, but I think there's good reason to think that it would have been particularly ugly and even more brutal than it was. Because we've seen throughout American history that nothing intensifies polarization and anger and a sense of rootlessness that manifests itself in particularly aggressive ways than the broadening of the political public to include people who had formerly been outsiders. So we've been talking throughout about codes of conduct and civility and norms. And there's a lot of reason to think that those tend to work better the more homogenous a group of insiders is, and the more they believe that everybody in the club is like them. If you diversify the club, that can breed mistrust, that can breed a sense of competition, and that can breed a desire to entrench new kinds of inequalities that get layered on top of other kinds of equality. So one of the reasons why you see, for instance, in the early 19th century, efforts to disenfranchise non-white men at the exact moment when there are efforts to give white men who had previously lacked the right to vote greater opportunity to vote, is because when you've created a society that is not going to have traditional natural inequalities based on class and other sorts of things, or you're not going to define the right to vote based on, say, property ownership, Are you really going to throw it open to everybody? Usually the answer is no. You have to invent new ways to exclude people. You don't need to exclude people from the right to vote on the basis of race if you've already done it on the basis of property. So it can seem in some ways more palatable because it's race neutral, or it can appear that way. But usually what happens in your proposed hypothetical, we're going to actually give everybody the right to vote and equal citizenship. Well, we saw what happened when equal citizenship was truly entrenched in the Constitution in the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. So it's not just a hypothetical. There were a lot of people in the United States who thought it was worth dying to prevent that from being a lived reality, to go to any length to ensure that there would be new unwritten rules that basically said that written rule wasn't in effect here. So I think it's hard to see how early politics wouldn't have followed a similar trajectory, that you would have created this truly level playing field on paper. Everybody has an equal voice and an equal opportunity. And there would have been a real effort to leverage power to create a new hierarchy that flew in the face of that formal equality.
You can't even imagine that the people at the time of the revolution would have entertained such an idea. It would be so anathema to the way that it could have happened. The thing that would have made it particularly complicated is just how hazy citizenship as an idea was in the early period, in the 19th century more broadly. So equal citizens on a state level, maybe citizenship as an idea would have developed differently. Maybe we would not have had a United States writ large as it is today. I think there's maybe a chance that we would not have the Union. I don't mean to suggest that's a good thing or a bad thing, just that we might have had sorting in a different way. States that were more accepting of that kind of thing and states that weren't, and then a breaking up of the Union because of the kinds of things that Jonathan is talking about. Very hard for me to imagine how that would have worked with such an enormous expected backlash and a union that was so fragile to begin with. I mean, there were so many times in early America where there was a possibility that the union would not survive. It was not just the Civil War. So to imagine this kind of setup is to imagine, I think, a United States that would not exist, which does not excuse it. It just suggests how fragile the experiment was in the first place.
So I happen to know that both Rachel and Jonathan have books in progress because we're all in a writing group with 3 other scholars who are also researching aspects of early American government. So Rachel and Jonathan, would you like to share what you're working on? And Jonathan, don't you have a book that just came out or is coming out soon? So would you like to tell us what's available for us to read?
I have a book coming out this fall, which explores the relationship between constitutional originalism and the study of history. Originalism is the popular but very controversial theory of U.S. constitutional interpretation that says that we should interpret the Constitution today in accordance with its original meaning. So among all theories of how we should interpret the Constitution, this is the one that places by far the greatest emphasis on history, and particularly the history of the founding moment of the United States, which I spend most of my day job studying. So it's this space where modern constitutional and political debates so squarely collide with history and historical study, because it asks both this broader question, which is very important to American civic life. To what extent should we be beholden to the things that came before? What should we take from history, learn from history? This is not just history as a form of edification that we scholars or readers or citizens might turn to, but a kind of legal command that how things work here is based on figuring out what they stipulated back then. But it also raises methodological questions that are at the heart of history. Everything Rachel and I have been talking about on this episode is how do you recapture on its own terms a world that is now gone? That's what historians spend all their time trying to figure out. How do we understand the past in an accurate way where we're not filtering it through modern bias and prejudice and assumptions? We're actually getting as close as we can to the way it worked back then. And the theory of constitutional originalism is a particularly potent way of framing that question, which has long intrigued me. How do we understand what the Constitution originally meant? To understand what the written Constitution said, how much of this unwritten culture do you need to understand what they understood? So the book is a meditation on those general themes.
Rachel, what about your forthcoming book, The Political Supreme Court?
My book is going to come out in 2026 with the University of North Carolina Press, and it is about the political activities and political culture of Supreme Court justices in the 19th century. It looks at how they engaged with politics, the way they thought about politics, and the relationship that the Supreme Court had to politics more broadly. So I show that the Supreme Court was thought of as part of the political system, not just part of the legal system, in particular by tracing its relationship to circuit riding, especially how the justices spent most of their time in circuit courts. They did not just serve as Supreme Court justices, they also had to serve as circuit court judges for most of the 19th century. And doing that brought them really close to the people, mostly elites in the states, but more the people than they are today. And it also made them more representative than we think of the justices today. They were selected from specific regions in the country that the circuits were divided into. And as a result, they were really engaging in sort of a politics of representation when they were on the Supreme Court. They came from political spaces and they continued in those political activities once they got on the Supreme Court. And we lost that culture of the Supreme Court. Not entirely, of course. Politics and the Supreme Court still operate together to some degree, but at least our expectations for what the Supreme Court should be and how it should operate has changed quite a bit. And the story of that is the story of my book, how we end up getting there at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So I am working on it and I am looking forward to finishing it up.
We always have more questions. So where's the best place for us to follow your work and get in contact with you?
Please feel free to email me. You can find my faculty webpage if you Google me through the Stanford History Department website. Happy to answer any and all questions that listeners might have about early American political culture, the first Congresses, what have you. This is great stuff, so happy to chat about it at greater length.
Me too. Please feel free to email me. I have a website, rachelsheldon.com. You can reach me through my department website and also through the Richard Center website. And you can also find me on Twitter or X, formerly Twitter, and also on Blue Sky.
Rachel Sheldon and Jonathan Ganapp, thank you for joining us and for helping us better understand some of the norms and understandings of early American political culture.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz.
As Rachel and Jonathan revealed, political culture is a term that historians use to describe the set of attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors that a society uses to define its ideas about politics and political behavior. In the early American Republic, early Americans saw their political culture as a set of formal institutions, written and unwritten behaviors and rules, and symbolic meaning that set the boundaries for how people should interact with their government, the Constitution, and engage with politics. Now, today, there are notions that early Americans were more civil and polite in the ways that they engaged in and with politics and political debate. However, the research done by Jonathan and Rachel and other scholars reflects a complex interplay between the ideas of how early Americans should have behaved to engage in civil and polite political debates and how early Americans' desires for their representatives to uphold and fight for their political positions led to honorable forms of violence. So were the ways in which early Americans wrote about and behaved politically more polite and civil than how Americans write about and behave politically today? The descriptions we heard make this question really hard to answer. Our world is far different from the early American Republic, and our views on violence have changed a great deal in the last 250 years. So a better question may be, why were the people of early America so politically engaged? Why did early Americans engage in newspaper and political debates about the Constitution? Why did they get so fired up and enthusiastic about interpretations of the Constitution and the direction of the nation that they engaged in acts of honorable and dishonorable violence? And what made everyday early Americans so confident in their knowledge about the Constitution that they felt empowered to discuss, debate, and petition their local communities, states, representatives, senators, judges, and presidents about the nature of the Constitution, the union it created, and their constitutional rights and liberties? Finding and thinking about answers to these questions may help us reignite our general interest in our government and our enthusiasm for ensuring our nation and democracy continue on in the directions we think they should. Plus, thinking about answers to these questions may also help us find a new sense of empowerment when it comes to being civically engaged and knowing that we, the people, have the power and expertise in the Constitution, our Constitution, to debate its shape and contents and influence the politics and political direction of our nation in big ways. You'll find more information about Jonathan and Rachel, their books, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/393. 3. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. And as we have a lot of exciting episodes coming up, please be a good friend and tell your friends and family about Ben Franklin's World. The Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios team has videos, web articles, and more podcast episodes to help you celebrate Constitution Day and think more about the origins of the American government and democracy. To explore these resources, visit benfranklinsworld.com/civics. Production assistance for this podcast come from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios: Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, Derek Lickback, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what do you think about the idea raised by Jonathan and Rachel that one of the reasons early Americans were so engaged in constitutional discussions and politics is that they had experienced the fragility of the American Union and nation? It has me thinking, and I'm curious what you think about this experience as a possible reason for why early Americans were so engaged in politics and constitutional thought. I'm also curious if you think that this inexperience that we have with the fragility of the Union is one reason that our present-day culture doesn't seem to be as engaged with politics or the Constitution. So let me know what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.